Hello, welcome to my Unit 8 presentation for Executive Chief Officer 3. My name is Keith Williams. I am an operator at an oil refinery in Southeast Louisiana. I've been here for 20 years, and I'm also an emergency responder with our refinery's emergency response organization. I serve as a firefighter, a hazmat specialist, and an EMT on our refinery rescue squad. So this particular assignment has us take 4 unit learning outcomes from all 3 of the Executive Chief Officer courses in the series. And the 4 that I chose actually all came from Executive Chief Officer 2. And those would be 8.1, 8.2, 5.4, and 8.4. And if you notice, I kind of put them in an order. They're not in order as they appear in the course, but they're in the order that they appear that makes sense. And hopefully, as we go through this, you'll get the feeling of how these learning outcomes kind of match up and stack in the grand scheme of things. So those will be select comprehensive disaster preparedness and resilience plans for communities, identify tactics for evaluating community resilience and adapting strategies for evolving risk, recognize methods for evaluating mutual aid effectiveness and optimize interagency cooperation, and recognize the effectiveness of preparedness and resilience planning. In order to effectively establish mutual aid and interdisciplinary collaboration, you must first know what you are planning for. This can be ascertained with the use of a THIRA, or Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. Once the THIRA is completed and specific hazards and risks are identified, the Executive Chief Officer can complete a needs assessment in order to help identify potential gaps in service to his or her community. At this point, the tactics for evaluating community resilience should be complete, and the team collaborates on strategies for the evolving risks. The Executive Chief Officer can move forward with interdisciplinary collaboration and mutual aid agreements. Collectively, through these agreements, all members can identify contractual obligations and agree upon methods for evaluation to prove effectiveness. Once the previous steps have been completed, the Executive Chief Officer, along with mutual aid representatives, should be able to recognize the effectiveness of preparedness and resilience planning. This is your stepping stone. Once once you once you get a feel for what your district is going to be, you have to conduct that diary. You have to conduct that risk assessment. The risk assessment will tell you where your potentials are. You could look at what are your capabilities and come up with your needs assessment to fill those capabilities. Any gaps, you can look for mutual aids. So systematically, you go through and identify your potential risk, um, you know, and just go from there. But your risk assessment has to be first. You have to plan or try to plan or get an idea of what you're planning for through your risk assessment. Executive chief officers can start by assembling a planning and action team that will be tasked with selecting comprehensive disaster preparedness and resilience plans for communities. Once the team is assembled, executive chief officers should follow: conduct a THIRA, develop a mitigation strategy, develop a preparedness plan, develop a response plan, develop a recovery plan, review and approve the plan, disseminate and implement the disaster plan per NFPA 2020. So this is just going back on what the previous slide says, kind of gives you systematically, breaks it down, how to get from point A to point B. Conduct your THIRA, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, approve, disseminate. The only other caveat to this would be to drill. Constantly drill or exercise or run simulations on your plan. That's the only way you're going to find gaps or holes where you can come back after an after actions review, um, create an action item, change order, change a procedure, add to, refine your plan, and then go back into the same process. So interdisciplinary collaboration, what exactly does that mean? Well, this refers to the process of working together with different disciplines or professions to share knowledge, skills, and resources, and to achieve common goals or objectives. Mutual aid. Well, mutual aid refers to the agreement or arrangement between fire and emergency services organizations to provide or receive assistance or support in case of emergencies that exceed the capacity or capability of one department. You don't necessarily have to have a disaster or an emergency to have mutual aid agreements. And you definitely don't need to have a disaster to have interdisciplinary collaboration. However, it is my opinion that you will not get through a major event without either of the two or both. Not trying to beat a dead horse, but what good is interdisciplinary collaboration or mutual aid without a thyra? You have to know where your vulnerabilities are and you have to know what your needs are. If you don't know your vulnerabilities by conducting your risk assessment, then you're never going to know what do you need, what else do you need brought to the table. Therefore, you won't be able to go out and make those mutual aid agreements. You won't be able to go out and conduct that interdisciplinary collaborations. So you have to start with the base, the stepping stone, the foundation, if you will, which is going to be that good, solid risk assessment. Strategies that can help enhance collaboration and ensure that mutual aid efforts are well coordinated and effective are as follows. And this is from GAO 14-220, February 2014. So we're going to define outcomes, clearly outline the desired outcomes of performance measures to ensure accountability and alignment of efforts. Performance measurement, develop performance measures that tie to shared outcomes and regularly monitor progress to track effectiveness. Resource allocations, utilize resources effectively, such as funding and staff, to enhance collaboration and support mutual aid efforts. I'm not going to elaborate much on these. These are very cut and dry. They're very to the point. You really can't read much between the lines here. Defining your outcomes. Well, you have to define what your end result needs to be, right? We have to create performance measurements. Otherwise, no one will know what to aspire to, what to work towards. Resource allocations. If you're not spending the right resources in the right spot, you're just, you're kind of wasting money, wasting time, and your people will suffer. Again, strategies that could help uh, enhance collaboration and ensure that mutual aid efforts are well coordinated and effective. We also want to integrate evaluation approaches. Employ a range of evaluation methods such as portfolio analysis, stakeholder surveys to assess the impact and effectiveness of mutual aid initiatives. Uh, information sharing, establish open channels for information exchange among participating agencies to facilitate coordination and mutual aid. So when you integrate your evaluation approaches, not only could you conduct your analysis, your portfolio analysis and stakeholder surveys, you could also conduct your simulations or your tabletop drills and include those into your stakeholder surveys as you bring your mutual aids to the table. But you have to continuously evaluate the effectiveness of your plan. The process of evaluating the effectiveness of the plan is through drills, assessments, audits, and simulations. These methods can help identify gaps, opportunities for improvement, weaknesses, and strengths. Feedback from evaluations can and should be incorporated into the plan to make up for any deficiencies, then reassess the plan. This should be a never-ending process as threats and hazards are always changing or adapting. Ensuring that your plans are up to date and account for as many potential hazards as relatively possible will help your districts and your community better prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover from a disaster. Again, this is pretty cut and dry. It serves you and your community. It serves you as an executive chief officer and your community no justice, no good whatsoever if you come up with a plan, but never attempt to test said plan until it's go time. You don't want to be faced with a disaster and it be the first time that you blow the dust off of a plan and try to put it in place and enact on that plan. That is a recipe for disaster. Con- Conduct your hazard and risk assessments, look for your weaknesses, build off of the weaknesses, build your plans, then test your plans. As you test your plans, evaluate and come back and strengthen your plan. There's going to be things you could add to it, there's going to be things you could take away from it. Strengthen those plans. Always, always, always drill and strengthen those plans. The effectiveness of preparedness and resilience planning can be recognized through several indicators. We'll talk about a couple here, and then on the next slide, I have another one we could talk about. The first one is going to be faster recovery times. This is your easiest one to recognize in your community. Preparation accelerates the return to normalcy after disaster events. So if you see community bouncing back relatively quick, you know you had a really good, pretty good plan. Reduce mortality rates. Uh, this is what it is. If your community has a good plan and they're bought into your plan and they're all on board with it, communities with well-developed preparedness measures experience fewer fatalities during disaster. That's just that's that that's pretty much a fact. And lastly, target-oriented preparedness. So successful preparedness measures focus on the specific needs of vulnerable populations, ensuring that resources are distributed equitably. So you, if you know you have your correct targets identified in your community and you're sending your resources accordingly, that's going to pay your dividends and it's going to be clearly evident in your response, in your preparedness for response. So a lot of that pre-plan, a lot of that work that's done up front will be blatantly obvious. These indicators highlight, and these are just a few, they highlight the importance of proactive measures in disaster management and the need for continuous improvement in preparedness and resilience planning efforts. Again, continuous improvement. Always look to make your plan better. The only way you're going to find out ways to make your plan better is through simulation, drills, exercises. Again, you don't want the day that the disaster hits to be the first time you run through a plan. That is just a recipe for a disaster, literally. So, in conclusion, for communities that face continually changing or evolving threats, hazards, or risk of disasters, both man-made and natural, they should realize the importance for emergency or disaster preparedness and resilience planning. Plans should outline the objectives, the goals, and resources needed to adequately prepare, prevent, mitigate, respond, and recover from these disasters. Plans should incorporate mutual aid agreements, memorandums of understanding, procedures, and policies that align with the best interests of the community and the fire and emergency services. Once plans are finalized, they should be disseminated and rehearsed or drilled to ensure no gaps exist. This can be done by means such as drills, exercises, and simulations. Any findings should be examined for potential change and accounted for in the plan. Executive chief officers should look for less fatalities, quicker recovery times, and target-based preparedness as ways to gauge or judge the effectiveness of preparedness and resiliency plans. Again, thank you very much for your time and your patience and your attention. This has been a wonderful series, starting with the company officer to the chief officer and now to the executive chief officer. I'd like to thank Columbia Southern University in collaboration with the International Association of Fire Chiefs for the opportunity for this course and for the periods of instruction. Thank you so much.